guess you're all probably wondering to a degree what we do. A lot of people don't know archaeologists work for the Forest Service, or that the Forest Service hires archaeologists. So basically, our job is dictated by the National Historic Preservation Act, which basically, outlines laws to protect significant historic properties on the land. And so those can be Native American sites, it can be historic sites. And so basically any project that the Forest Service does, even if it's trail reroutes, if there's significant trail reroutes, those folks get a hold of our shop and we identify if there's a need for us to go out and survey, walk the land, take a look, see if there's artifacts, see if there's other types of site features out there, and to record those and document them. And then we evaluate whether or not they're significant, whether or not they're warrant management and protection by the Forest Service. We document all sites that we find out on the forest, but it's the really special ones, the cream of the crop, that we choose to protect. And so when the Forest Service goes to initiate different projects, whether, like I said, trail projects or timber sales, we make sure that those sites are protected and avoided, essentially. And we work with 3 tribes in the state. We consult with the Nez Perce tribe, the Shoshone Paiute tribes, and the Shoshone Bannock tribes. So basically all projects that we have, we also go through tribal consultation. So it's, quite a process, but through that process we learn about what aspects of sites, what landscapes are valuable to the tribes, and kind of we get more answers for the why. Why are we protecting these places? So it can be really rich and fruitful to have those consultations with tribes. So yeah, basically a lot of what we do involves survey of the landscape. We don't survey everything, every inch. We wouldn't survey really steep slopes necessarily, but we have a model, a predictive model that we use in GIS to identify locations that have a higher probability for sites. So basically, places that we like to camp is probably places that people historically liked to camp. And so, proximity to water, steepness of slope, gentle benches, places like that really require our thorough survey. And then the types of sites that we find out there, as I mentioned, we find Native American archaeological sites. And so those can consist of artifacts, just not only arrowheads, but flakes, what we call waste flakes from when a person is making an arrowhead. And we have 3 material types on the forest. We have obsidian, chert, and basalt that was used to make tools. And we brought some artifacts and some examples if you guys want to see some stuff.
We can pass them around if you guys would.
I'll just grab one of each and just
Okay, yeah, that'd be cool.
Perfect. Thanks, Alls.
The obsidian is pretty fun because we don't have any obsidian sources on the Payette, and so any obsidian that we find is cultural. It's human material that was brought there. And so that can help us identify travel or trade routes. We have obsidian from all kinds of sources that include Nevada, that big obsidian source in Yellowstone in Montana. We have some obsidian from there.
Eastern Oregon. A lot from Eastern Oregon.
Yeah. And the closest obsidian source that we have is actually by Banks. It's up on the bench to the west of the river, and it's called Timber Butte. And so that obsidian you can kind of identify by eye. If you hold up a flake made of that obsidian, usually it has these stratified lines. And so if we have some Timber Butte obsidian, we can pass it around and you can look at it. It's kind of fun. It's the only one you can identify by eye. But then we send it off to testing and sourcing and get some data on that. Other Native American features that we find out there include pit house features. And Molly can talk a little bit about the Native American site that's here and the pit house features. So those were semi-subterranean dwellings. So basically, for the Nez Perce, that was the main dwelling style prior to the Nez Perce getting horses, so prior to the 1700s. And basically there'd be this dugout and then a dome of like a wood structure, and then either boughs or hides. And so what you end up seeing that remains on the landscape is these shallow depressions that are about no more than like 3 feet deep.
Yeah, they typically dig them about 1 meter subsurface. They were frequently used as a winter dwelling because they were warmer. And so they would be a hole about 1 meter deep would be excavated. You could have multiple families living in them. And a lot of times for the bigger structures, you would have a bench built into the side. And the bench could be for sleeping. It could also be for storage. So sometimes when you're excavating through these features, you'll find the bench, and then you'll find kind of a little cache where you might have had a mat laid over the top. And that's where you would keep your cold storage at. I just took a trip down memory lane. One time we found a fully articulated salmon wrapped up in birch bark in one of those little cold stashes. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, jump in at any time. Yeah, and so that's actually a good segue. We don't really excavate on the forest. Part of that is just an agreement that we have with the tribes. The tribes really prefer, I mean, they're not against excavation, but they support it in just certain situations. And so a lot of what we do is just surface survey to identify what's on the surface. And there has been a few excavations that have happened on the forest over time, but not very frequently. And you know, part of the tribal perspective there that I've heard during consultations is that these artifacts that are in that location ties and connects those people to that landscape. And so if you remove that, it impacts that connection. And I think a really good way for us to think about it is if we drive by an old childhood home and our connection to that place. You know, someone might live there, or maybe you even drive by. For instance, I drove to my grandfather's house when he was a child back in Pennsylvania, and I've never lived there, but the connection that I felt to that place because my grandfather lived there. Can you imagine that magnified by thousands of years? And I'll say, you know, when we do field trips and youth camps and presentations with tribal members, and I work with tribal youth, and when we're at a site that's filled with obsidian or artifacts from their ancestors, the connections to those places is really impactful, you know, just from what I observe. So yeah, as a part of that, you know, we try not to excavate those sites.
That's a very good point, and I was just gonna, you know, further articulate that oftentimes when you do see, you know, kind of a National Geographic style excavation, that is the result of a lot of collaboration with the tribes that have ownership over that area. It's not something that's often, you know, taken lightly. Because it impacts the site, and you'll have a list of kind of mitigations that the tribe asks for you to do after that excavation is closed. You know, whether they want the artifacts back in the pit, or what they would like done with those. But another reason that we don't often do full-scale excavation like that is because our job is to try to help avoid impact. And so if we identify a notable site that's visible on the surface, we oftentimes assume that there is more site that exists subsurface. So we just kind of right off the bat make the call that we would like to avoid that area. Now, in other circumstances, federal agencies and other land management entities will excavate, and it's kind of as a salvage approach. So this site, for example, was excavated a couple of times prior to the creation of Hell's Canyon Dam. And that's called salvage excavation, and that's to try to glean as much information and paint a complete picture before something that is going to happen one way or the other happens. So that way, at the very least, we can walk away and say, okay, this is what was here. And hopefully we can take away as much information as possible so that when people have questions in the future, they can look back to those records and answer those same questions. But we are not doing that in this day and age.
Yeah.
So the most we do is test excavation, and that is to, if we have reasonable doubt whether or not there is more of a site that exists subsurface, we will do either, auger testing and just kind of dig a little hole at incremental measurements, and then screen that back dirt to ascertain whether or not there's anything in there. But again, most of the time we get to spend our time walking around and looking for things on the surface, and drawing our conclusions from that instead.
Yep. Yeah, and so that entails a lot of what we do, and then obviously we do a lot of paperwork. I do a lot of paperwork these days.
Lots of
I
paperwork.
feel for you, yeah. Or I feel with you. And just writing reports on those results and reporting back to the tribes and to the state and just the different entities that we have to report to. But to kind of go back to discussing what types of sites that we see on the land. So we talked about Native American archaeological sites that we see. We also have Native American sacred sites across the forest, and the ones in particular that I'm thinking of, we just identified during a project on a part of the forest. Basically, the Forest Service was proposing to put in an ATV loop, and we identified rock cairns on these ridges. And basically, when I was out surveying the ridges, I was at one rock cairn, and the degree of lichen growth on the rocks was really substantial. So you could tell that these rocks had not been disturbed for a very long time. And once I was at that part of the ridge and I was surveying that cairn, I'd look over at a different section of the ridge and see another kind of prominent little point. And so after conducting our survey, we found 5 of these cairns within a 1.5 mile radius. And so there was quite the concentration. And there were no archaeological remains. There were no artifacts. There was just these rock cairn structures that were obviously human-made and very old because of the dense lichen growth on them. For instance, we have some rock cairns made by sheep herders, like Basque and other sheep herders, and they're over 100 years old, and they barely have any lichen growth on them compared to these rocks. So that was just kind of a relative comparative for me. And so because we didn't have any artifacts associated with these sites, we decided to send our reports, our pictures to the different tribes and ask them, hey, are these tribal sites, are they of significance? And it's through that consultation process that we found out that these are sacred sites, or part of tribal ceremonies, and they serve a role and still do today. And so that's another reason why those tribal consultations are important. I really see our job, archaeology, as one piece of the puzzle and one story, but learning from the tribes and their ethnographic information, such as their traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, is another piece of the puzzle, and it presents more of a holistic understanding for a place when you do that kind of consultation with tribes. So we have those kinds of sites across the forest, pit houses. What else?
Travel routes. We have a number of travel routes that are demarcated by, sometimes we interpret those cairns that Morgan was just talking about as an indicator of a travel route. Or, in the case of the Whitebird Ridge Native American Trail, it's a known travel route that we've heard about through oral histories. It was on maps, and when we walk it, we'll find isolated artifacts. So we won't find a big site where people were sitting there and creating these tools, or cooking food, or sleeping, or whatever. But you'll find items dropped along the way, and that's another reason that ridge lines are on our within our predictive model, and something that we look closely at during survey. But other than
cambium-peeled trees. Those are kind of fun. Well, they are fun. And so cambium-peeled trees, they're a site. We have groves of these trees all over the forest, and they occur mostly on ponderosa pines. And so basically the outer bark of the pines would be peeled off, and these strips of the cambium would be torn off and then eaten or given to horses. And so a few years ago, we did a project where we had some Nez Perce tribal interns, and they interviewed elders. And so we got more information about the practices associated with those cambium-peeled trees. And so essentially, those strips, the cambium would be collected in the spring when the sap was rising from the roots and sending up all those nutrients into the needles. And so, when you're coming out of winter, I think if you can imagine coming out of winter and not having an orange or not eating any vegetation, and then that inner cambium in the spring can just feel like a lifesaver. And so we were out on a project and tried some, was it lodgepole cambium, and it's really citrusy, and I'm sure it's just packed full of vitamin C. Yeah. And so so what remains on the trees are just these scars, and the trees are still alive. And like I said, we have groves of them. We have interpretive signs and stuff.
They just kind of look like these big circles cut out of the bark, and oftentimes you can still, they're at kind of at eye level. And oftentimes you can still see the axe marks where they cut through that cambium layer to peel it back. And we have some that, are super old, and you have to kind of like look under the bark, and you can just like maybe see the edge of an axe mark. But yeah, they're a fun one because you'll just be walking and then you'll notice that this thing is staring at you.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, they start to close up over time. The tree heals itself. And so, so yeah, we record those and have some fun inter projects with the Nez Perce tribe on that. And then we have sites, I guess dating on that, some of the oldest dates that we have for those cambium-peeled trees are 1847. So, I mean, that you can think, well, that doesn't really seem that long ago. But if you think about, a lot of our forests have been logged. A lot of those trees probably aren't there anymore, or the lifespan of some of those trees. And so, but basically, you can take core samples of those peels and identify an age range. And so I think the oldest we have is 1847, and the most recent is the 1890s that we have. And then we have historic sites, so Euro-American historic sites across the forest. We have mining sites. There's a lot of mining sites up in these higher elevations up out of this canyon. Even this location, and even lower elevation, there's been a lot of mining activity in here historically. And then we have homestead sites. There was a homestead here. A lot of these benches have these layers of history where you'll have Native American sites and then homestead sites, and then maybe before that mining sites. And so it's kind of interesting to look through the layers of use at places like these and how rich the different stories are.
Yeah, no, and this site in particular is a really great example of that, given that, it probably started as a very ephemeral camping location for Native peoples in this corridor, and then it became a winter village, a house pit village. And then in 1862, copper was found. up directly above here at the Peacock Mine. And then I'm sure there were small-scale mining activities, and then on top of that, there was a homestead and a fruit orchard, and people would travel all over. And now in 2022, we're all sitting here talking about it.
That's why it's terraced like this, is in part due to the orchards that were once here, and there's some remnant fruit trees still here. Yeah.
In terms of other historic sites that we have on the forest, correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan, not so much here, but farther east over towards Warren, that area, we had a tremendous Chinese mining presence. And I'll actually let you talk about that because I really appreciate the way that you packaged that one.
And when the Chinese would come in, they would mine for the finer gold dust, just the remnant gold dust or gold flour is what they called it. And so they'd rework tailings. And so it was super hard, strenuous work, just reworking tailings, but it was really profitable. And so that's why you see a lot of mining history in Idaho with districts that did invite the Chinese to come back through. And sometimes because it was so profitable, it caused some tensions in some of those communities between the Euro-Americans and the Chinese that were there. But Warren actually was pretty mellow. There wasn't a lot of tensions between the Euro-Americans and the Chinese that were there. The Chinese that came through, they mostly came through from one province called Guangdong province, and they were really working class, you know, probably living in pretty significant poverty, and they saw an opportunity, and a lot of them came through these sponsorships or kind of services through Chinese mining companies. So there was these big companies that would solicit and get folks to come from China. They'd help transport them here to the States, and then they would be populated in all these different mining districts, and they moved around a lot. They didn't just stay in one district. You know, they might be in California for a few years, and then they hear that gold mining districts are opening up in Idaho, and so then they would travel out to Idaho. And so, but basically they served these companies, so they were just really laborers for the companies. A lot of them weren't getting rich like themselves. And in exchange for all that kind of support and infrastructure from the mining companies, the Chinese mining companies that were based out of Seattle and San Francisco, you had to pay services, or you had to pay dues, and you would get various services. And one of the services in Warren is that if you died in the mining district, they would send your remains back to China. And so we have a Chinese cemetery there with about 40 grave sites, but most of them, the remains were sent back to China. And so a lot of them died in the late 1890s, mostly in the late 1890s, but they sent remains back as late as the 1930s. And we have like oral history documentation of just like local Warren folk that watched, you know, this kind of convoy of mules come in, get some of the remains, package them up in these cedar boxes, and then send them back to China. But the women who came through often came through, you know, slavery or pretty rough conditions. And so, you know, we think that just looking at our census data that there's at least one woman that's still buried in that Chinese cemetery, and there may be more. But it's just a little hard to track. So yeah, we have a bunch of Chinese mining sites all over Warren, and the Chinese mined in here too. There was a really significant Chinese mining presence as well in this canyon, but there were tensions here, and there was a massacre, and there has since been kind of a memorial to recognize just the contributions that the Chinese made to the settlement of the area. And there's still some Chinese Americans in Boise who are descendants of the Chinese that were here, which is so incredible to hear their stories. We've been working with a few of those people. They've come out with us on field trips to Warren, because we have some of our sites are these terraced gardens. The Chinese in Warren would terrace the hillsides and then grow produce. So they wouldn't just mine, they'd grow produce. And so we have these remnant terraces from the Chinese. And some of their plants, they have hops and grapes that still grow there. We've got a cutting off the hops out there that grow in my garden now. And so just some fun stuff.
Yeah. And it's very exciting when you're visiting a site to see some of these items, because they brought their material culture over here. Some of the things that you're looking at over there, there's a soy sauce pot, and there's a spoon, and it looks like there's the piece of wood that has the Chinese characters on it. And that specifically is an opium tin that you're looking at. And that plank of wood with the Chinese characters on it was from a shop, a merchant's shop. And reportedly, those characters are some sort of calendar for activities to be done on a certain day and time. And it's just a pretty exciting thing to be walking through central Idaho, and then you look down and you see a little fragment of a celadon rice bowl. And that's not something that was made here. It was carried a very long way.
Or we'll find coins that are like 400 years old. So even though when it was brought, the Chinese that were using it here might have been like 1870s, it was from like, 400 years past. And it's pretty incredible that this stuff is just still on the land.
Yeah. Lots of layers. In terms of other historic sites, I'm trying to think if I should just transition into this specific area.
Yeah, why don't you?
Yeah.
Do you guys have any questions? Maybe we'll pause. We've been talking a lot.
Yeah, sorry. And you guys probably also want to eat food, too.
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah, really good point.
Yeah, I've got a question. You guys must know of these sites all over the place. Once you make a discovery, are there issues with finding balance between, okay, how do we protect this and at the same time identify it? Does that make sense? So once people know that it's there, they're going to want to see it, and once they want to see it, now you've got to worry about protecting it, but you know it's there, so you've got to do something.
Super challenging. Yeah, it's not easy. It's kind of a case-by-case issue. I mean, as you can imagine, the content, the resources that we protect, it's confidential, but in a lot of locations, people already know that these places exist. And so where do you find that balance between education and trying to encourage stewardship, but also not trying to expose a site further for looting? Fortunately, on our forest, we've only had a few cases of looting that have been documented in our program that I know about. So it's not super frequent, but I think mostly a lot of people don't realize, if you're out walking in the woods and you find some artifacts, whether they're Native American artifacts or some Chinese stuff, you think, oh, cool, I'm going to put this in my pocket. And a lot of folks don't realize that that's against the law. And I know that, illegal, legal doesn't necessarily always motivate certain behaviors or actions, but when those things are removed from a location, really what it does is it takes away the opportunity for us to document that history that occurred at that place, and for us to try and complete or create a more complete picture. And
for a person who has a personal connection or tie to that site, whatever that might be, it takes away the opportunity for them to be able to come back to that site and experience it and pick that thing up and say, oh my gosh, I know how this got there.
Right.
And and as Morgan articulated before, that's a very powerful thing. It's it's a part of our moving landscape.
And it's, why we don't excavate anymore is because we don't want to have an adverse effect on these places. So a lot of the artifacts that we have are from excavations that happened on the forest in the 1980s through like U of I or other universities. And then some of the artifacts like we have in this box, they haven't been accessioned, so we don't know where they came from. So we just use them for educational purposes. But yeah, that's not like an easy answer. We just try and do the best we can. But I think where we see locations where there's a lot of recreational use, we try and do put up interp. And I mean, it's across the board. We have a site, an old bomber plane. You guys might know about it up at Loon Lake around McCall. It's a really popular hiking trail, and it goes out to this plane that had to have an emergency landing there in the 1940s. Yeah, in the 1940s. And basically the plane's been walking all off the site since the 1940s, meaning people are walking away with so much of the plane to the extent that it's just not even, I mean, they've impacted it so much that this rich history and the story of these four guys that survived this plane wreck in the middle of nowhere in the winter is just incredible. And that's what that plane symbolizes. And so, you know, we're planning on doing some updated interp of that site to educate people about not collecting pieces of the plane. And we want to show a before and after photo, really, of what it looked like, because that's just really impactful.
And looking at other forests and national recreation areas that, you know, do have to deal with this on a much more frequent basis than we do. It seems like giving people ownership in their history is a really good way to kind of help protect it. So yeah, that's the intent with the interp panels, is talking about it and the importance and it's, you know, part of your history. But that's a really good question, and it's a hard one.
Let us know if you have a better answer or ideas.
Yeah, do you have thoughts?
You're wrestling with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard too, especially with tribal sites and just working with tribes. Adds in a whole nother layer. Yeah. Do you want to talk about Cooper's Ferry just real quick? It's just like really exciting. I don't know if you guys know about Cooper's Ferry.
Yeah, we'll cover it quick, but like if you guys need to eat dinner, this is also, you know, you tell us. But Cooper's Ferry is a really incredible site. Cooper's Ferry is located on the Lower Salmon River outside of Cottonwood, Idaho. And it is a site that has historically very old Native American artifacts have been found at this site. So when I say very old, you know, I'm talking 12,000 years ago. And that is fitting with the story that I think probably a lot of us were told about the peopling of the Americas, being the Bering Land Bridge and the ice-free corridor. The ice receded enough when water levels were low that people could scamper across Beringia into North America. And there have been a handful of sites in both North and South America that have dates far older than that 12,000 year mark. And up until recently, everybody just scoffed. They're like, 24,000 years ago in Chile? Of course not, that's not a thing. The researcher, Lauren Davis, who has been kind of sitting on this Cooper's Ferry site, and by sitting on it, I mean doing extensive research so that he could come to the table with a very well-researched and thought-out answer. He has discovered tools that date to 17,500 years ago. And the extent to which he researched these and the various dating methods that he used to gather those dates are definitive. People have stopped scoffing. And the reason that this is very exciting is because it changes the story that we now have for the peopling of the Americas. So by 17,500 years ago, there was not an ice-free corridor. People could not have moved east into North America. So the interpretation of this is now that that people traveled, likely at this point, again, a hypothesis, a theory, that people traveled via the coastline, that they were seafaring peoples who kind of stuck to the coast and then moved down. And it's entirely plausible that this happened well over 20,000 years ago, which is a dramatically different story than, I think we had written in our textbooks. And it's just a very exciting thing that the site that kind of changed that is in our watershed, right up here. It's not on the Payette National Forest. It's technically on BLM land. But it's a really exciting site, and it's been tremendously impactful to the field of archaeology and for, tribal communities that live here. It's very validating, to have this scientific evidence stating that they've been here for such a long period of time. And the fact that this site is on, kind of a tertiary river to the Columbia River Basin means that people had time to change and move inland from being a seafaring people to being kind of an inland terrestrial group of hunter-gatherers. So, meaning that 17,500 years ago, that's certainly not the earliest date. They had time to change into a different type of resource gathering community. But that's a pretty cool thing that happened in Idaho. Yeah. And it's changing our textbooks, which is pretty cool. So thanks for letting me nerd out on that. But if you want, I will give you guys a quick rundown. I know earlier you asked what this area would have looked like prior to the dams. And so I'll just try to give kind of a quick synopsis of, the history of the area. We talked a bit about Native American communities in this area. The Nez Perce being, this is, part of the heart of their homeland. But there were also other tribes that considered this place a very familiar location, being Shoshone, Paiute, Walla Walla, Umatilla, and there's another one.
Warm Springs?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially Warm Springs.
Yeah, Warm Springs.
Mm-hmm. And then in 1862, the same year that gold was discovered up in Warren, Levi Allen and his crew were traveling upstream on a steam engine, and they were trying to find a navigable path up the Snake River upstream of Lewiston. And he and his crew discovered a copper lode, a copper vein, just up here. And he called it the Peacock Mine. And once they got done with their survey, it was called the Peacock Mine because it was kind of this beautiful blue, rich blue color, very peacock-esque. And once they finished their survey, the whole crew decided, meh, we don't need to, we're done with this survey thing, let's go mine. And they found copper, gold, and silver in the area. And word got out, and various other miners, prospectors came, and the area grew to be kind of a hub, a mining hub, primarily copper. And they established the Seven Devils mining district up here. A little farther downstream was the Heath mining district. As you guys pass Brownlee Creek, just upstream of that is where the Heath mining district would have been. And as the Wild West was, this drew all sorts of enterprising characters. And one notable character was Albert Kleinschmidt, I think. Albert, is that his first name? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He came over from Montana, and he bought the Peacock Mine. And he, for some reason that I don't know, he he decided he wanted to ship his copper ore all the way back to Anaconda, Montana for processing. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with where that is, but if you drive on I-90 from Missoula to Bozeman, it's about halfway in between. So it's not anywhere around here. But that was something that he felt strongly he needed to do. And then he started running up on the cost of shipping it. And so in 1889 and 1890, he built the Kleinschmidt grade. And that runs from where Hell's Canyon Park is right now on up to what was then called the Blue Jacket Mine. It's now called Sporopolis Ranch, if any of you guys have driven around up in that area. And his intent with that was to make it easier for pack trains to amble down with the ore to the river, and then that would be, you know, a much quicker route to ship it. Unfortunately, he ran into a lot of legal trouble because a lot of the money that he said he had, he didn't have. So there was kind of this great game of musical chairs where he would sell one thing and then try to buy something else, and then that check would go bad, and so he just kind of...
Yeah, totally.
Yes. But then in the earlier 1900s, things started slowing down, and by the 1960s, they'd almost completely dropped off mining-wise. They picked up a little bit again around the 1990s, early 1980s, and then by 1990, they had stopped mining in the area. So all in all, over the course of about 120 years, this area produced a little over $180 million worth of valuable ore and minerals. That is, it sounds big, but really comparatively, it was actually quite small. There were several places in Montana that produced 3 times that in like 10 years. But as mining kind of dropped off, that drew other interests into the area. So you would have had ranching communities for both sheep and cattle, and then homesteaders like this homestead that we're sitting on. So the 2 graves down the road, or just down the road a little bit, belong to John Eccles and Archibald Ritchie. And both of them had homesteads on Big Bar. And they were fruit merchants, among many other things. So you'll see these terraces, and they grew fruit, and people would travel from all over to come and pick and then pack it up in their boxes, load up their horse or mules, and head back to their homesteads. And when did they pass away? I'm trying to remember.
But I don't know if you guys have seen their gravesite, the interp sign.
Year on it, the
Yeah.
other one doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Remember the year though.
But as some of these original homesteaders passed away, you know, either the homesteads would kind of fall into disrepair or they would change hands, and then eventually, a lot of them, yeah, they're not in use anymore. Are there any active homesteads?
I think,
Down here right now?
homesteads had to be patented in order for it to become private land. A lot of them, you'd have to show your improvements over time, and a lot of them weren't patented because of that. They weren't able to show their improvements and that they were profitable. So then a lot of them went back to Forest Service land, or maybe at a later time, the Forest Service or BLM, other entities bought the land back up. And then just the Native American use in this whole corridor is pretty extensive. All these drainages have sites, archaeological sites, but also cave sites. We have a lot of cave sites. This is a dense cave site area in the limestone, and some of the caves have pictographs. We have a site up here called Redfish Cave that has, it's quite a big cave, and it's got a lot of stalactites and stalagmites, and it was vandalized quite a bit up into the 1980s, so it's gated now. But a lot of these caves have, are really interesting because of the natural qualities of them, but also they have arc sites in them as well.
Mm-hmm. You guys, do you have any questions now that we've talked your ears off?
No, it just gives us a lot to think about since we're here and we've seen it now and we've seen it from a different perspective that opens up a whole nother way to imagine what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As you work up Allison Creek, keep your eyes peeled for more fruit trees.
Mm-hmm.
There would have been more up there.
Old stone wall up there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The pear terrace.
Yeah. Yeah.
It apparently has a pear tree on it.
We're like, is that a house?
Yeah.
That makes way more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that's all that I had. Do you have anything else, Max?
No. You guys are probably hungry. Yeah. Yeah.